everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Wendy Fulton, the Digital Events Platform Developer with the Windsor-Essex Chamber of Commerce. We'll just give the rest of our attendees a couple of minutes to join the meeting. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel by the end of the day. If you're interested in viewing any of our previous webinars, you can find them on our YouTube channel or on our website. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Our next webinar is scheduled for September the 30th. This free webinar is being presented by Gaia Digits. They'll be discussing the online products they have to help with COVID screening and managing your workplace. It looks like we're ready to start the webinar now. So I'll hand the floor over to Rakesh Naidu, the President and CEO of the Windsor-Essex Chamber of Commerce.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Wendy. Welcome, everyone, to the Windsor-Essex Regional Chamber of Commerce Business Brief webinars. Well, you know what? We are still in stage 3, unfortunately, and the chamber is very well aware of the challenges that businesses are facing in this situation. Unfortunately, our numbers are not looking great. We are, as we all know, in the midst of the 4th wave. Today, we've had 47 new cases. 22 of these are outbreaks. And of the 22, 19 are workplace-related outbreaks. So just goes to show that it is extremely important that we keep our workplace safe. We all need to do our part to keep the numbers low. Unfortunately, Windsor-Essex has one of the highest weekly case rate in Ontario. So, we all need to do our best, and this webinar is a step in that direction. So, we also have heard what has happened elsewhere. After a lot of resistance, Alberta has agreed to move forward and have vaccination passport system implemented there. It's a bit different than what is being implemented in Ontario. But as you know, that in Ontario, come September 22nd, we will have a vaccination passport system that will be implemented. And come October 22nd, there will be an app that will be in place so that, the vaccination status can be verified. So as the chamber, we believe that this is a step in the right direction. However, we also understand that it's not easy for businesses to implement this. And we've advocated for businesses to be provided the support that is needed, because clearly the onus of implementation and the burden of implementation cannot be on the businesses. As is, businesses are very much suffering. There is additional effort that they need to put in to keep their workplace safe. Revenues are not as they were before, and one additional burden of implementation will be way too much for businesses to carry. So we've talked about what can be done. We've also advocated that as and when the vaccination passport is implemented, it be tied with capacity enhancements. Because clearly, if there is going to be vaccination passport, and if you're going to use that to keep the workplace safe, there has to be some incentive for businesses to comply with that and open up their business capacity a little bit more and allow more customers and clients to come in. So that's something that your chamber is very actively advocating for. In addition to everything else that needs to be done, make sure that the implementation is easy and safe. There's so many exceptions that have been identified. Enforcement is going to be challenging. So we'll work our way through this, and just know that your chamber is there looking at this issue very carefully and working with the other chambers, including the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, to really make the implementation smooth. One thing that can help us in workplace, and as I mentioned that about 19 of the 22 outbreaks today are workplace related, is the use of rapid test kits. And as you know that the chamber has been providing this rapid test kits free of cost. We have, as of this morning, we have got over 42,000 test kits that have been given to businesses in the Windsor-Essex area, and these are completely free of cost. So please reach the chamber's office and get your rapid test kits. It's a very simple way to keep your workplace safe. You can also provide a great deal of confidence to your consumers, to your customers, your clients, as you use this. And it is one really good way to avoid outbreaks in the workplace. So again, reach out to the chamber's office and Towards the end of this webinar, my colleague here will provide you some more information on the rapid test kits. And as you know that in September and also a little bit earlier, a lot of businesses have looked into bringing back employees back to work, back to working from office, and many still continue to work from home, or in some cases, there's a blended version. The blended model is also working for some businesses. But we found that more and more businesses are now exploring the option of bringing back employees. And with that has come a lot of questions about vaccination policy. There is quite a bit of discussion that is happening. There's also quite a bit of confusion around it in terms of what are employees required to do, what can they ask for, what they can't ask, what is the mandate that they can put in place, what are some of the policies that they can put in place, and if they have a policy, how it can be amended. So there's a lot of questions that have arisen as a result of vaccination requirements. And we recognize that this is a complicated topic. There is no one answer that can apply or one solution that can apply to all businesses. Each business has its own unique needs and requirements. So we still wanted to really provide you with an opportunity to hear from some of the experts that we have in a region in terms of what the employees are required to do, what the employers are required to do, and what are some of the implications around it. So to provide you some more insight, we have, as I mentioned, two really wonderful experts from a region. We have Julie Radlin. She's a human resource executive with Green Shields Canada. And Julie's work life has included entrepreneurial pursuits and senior leadership roles within progressive, dynamic organizations. Her passion is developing and executing strategies and initiatives to enable organization growth, performance, and agility with world-class culture and highly motivated and engaged employees. She's currently Vice President, Organization Development and Total Rewards with Green Shields Canada. Julie has an undergraduate degree from the University of Western Ontario. She also has a master's certificate in executive coaching from Royal Roads University and a master's certificate in strategic business leadership from York University. She holds a certified human resources executive designation and is a certified executive coach. Our second panelist is Dave Amyot. David began his legal career with McTague law firm in 2000 and has been a partner in the firm's labor and employment group since 2007. Dave acts on behalf of employees exclusively and provides legal expertise and representation in collective bargaining, labor arbitration, wrongful dismissal actions, human rights applications, and various proceedings before the Canadian Industrial Relations Board and the Ontario Labour Relations Board. Dave also acts as a prosecutor on behalf of police services organizations for disciplinary proceedings under the Police Services Act. Dave represents a myriad of clients throughout Ontario in a wide range of industries, including public institutions, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, telecommunications, healthcare, and hospitality. Ladies and gentlemen, your two panelists, our local experts, are here. And just something as a housekeeping matter, we have before the webinar, we asked for people to submit their questions. We've taken those questions and we have fed it to both Julie and Dave so that their presentations can touch upon some of the questions that were asked. So the presentation will touch upon most of the questions that were sent over to us. Now, if you have anything that is specific to your organization, we encourage you to reach out to David, by yourself. As we have over 140, 150 people here, we may not be able to get into too much of detail, which may be specific to your business and workplace. So with that in mind, I now will turn this over to David and to Julie. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Rakesh. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Julie and I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and copies are with the chamber. So you'll have access to that once the webinar is done. We were asked to talk about vaccination policies in the workplace, but the only thing I can tell you for certain is whatever I tell you or Julie tells you today is very likely to change in the next weeks or months to come as the pandemic essentially evolves. It is a work in progress. But we thought it'd be best right now to at least explain to you the state of the law in the province of Ontario as it is today, and then provide you with some firsthand, I guess, experience from Julie's part in terms of what her organization is doing. In a minute, I'm going to put the slideshow up on my screen. I'm going to do a share screen here. Hopefully it'll work out. And Julie and I are going to essentially weave in and out of this presentation for speaking points. So there may be a little bit of a, I guess, coordination involved there. So please be patient with us. And without any further ado, I'm going to start my slideshow here. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that just fine. And I've got control to advance the slides. So by way of introduction, obviously Ontario moves towards and through the fourth wave of COVID-19. Obviously we're dealing with the Delta variant, which has complicated things quite a bit in terms of just our society's handling of the pandemic. And a large portion of our clients are calling us about vaccine policies. These are public sector and private sector employers. There's not a day that goes by in my office where myself or any of my colleagues aren't answering questions about vaccine policies. Really, the issue boils down to this for employers. What do I have to do? Meaning, what do I have to do legally today? And then after that is, what can I do in terms of maintaining a safe workplace for my employees?
Mm-hmm. And I'll just pipe in, and good morning, everyone. Green Shield Canada is a large local employer, and we too have contemplated these questions. As David's going to cover in the next couple of slides, to have a vaccination policy or a testing policy. However, for our organization, which I suspect is going to be the case for many employers on this webinar, the question, which is kind of at the bottom there, to end the pandemic and to best protect the health and safety of people and your employees, the question to address is, what can you do? And encourage you to consider the information we're going to put forth in developing what feels right for you as far as a vaccination and or a testing policy.
Okay, so the next several slides are focusing on what is the state of the law here in Ontario. I just want to make one note. The next discussion points deal with provincially regulated employers. We simply didn't have enough time to discuss the state of the law for federally regulated employers. So keep that in mind as we go through the next couple of slides. So as you can see on the slide here, there's reference to the Health Protection and Promotion Act. So as it stands now, there's two pieces of law that require certain specific employers to have a vaccination policy in place in their workplace. And also it sets out what has to be in that policy. The first one is called Directive Six. This is under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, or the HPPA. And it was issued by the government. And basically it applies to hospitals, very specified community, like local integrated health networks, and other medical work employers or workplaces. It has a very limited application. And really what it does is it mandates that those employers, and I'll just use hospitals as an example, that's the largest set of employers that fall under what's called Directive Six. It mandates those employers to actually have a vaccination policy in place. The other piece of law that came in to require vaccinations for certain type of employers happened about 2 weeks after Directive Six came online. And that is, it's basically instructions from the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Ontario to post-secondary education institutions. And the authority for that comes under Regulation 36420, which is a regulation to the overarching law, which is the Reopening Ontario Act. That's the act that sets out the various stages of reopening. So regulation to that act. Okay, so on August 17th, Directive 6 was issued by the chief. CMOH means Chief Medical Officer of Health. I already talked about this. It applies to covered organizations, primarily health, almost exclusively healthcare. The big ones are hospitals. Requires covered organizations to have a vaccination policy. And let me explain because it also says what that policy should actually contain. In real simple terms, the regulation requires that employees in these workplaces need to provide proof of vaccination or proof that they're unable to be vaccinated due to medical reasons, and also for a medical certificate to be provided by a doctor or nurse practitioner. And that certificate states how long those medical conditions are to apply or last. Or if they're not vaccinated or deemed unvaccinated, they are required to undergo periodic, regular COVID-19 antigen testing. And the interval can be no greater than 7 calendar days. Sure. So on August 25th, the government amended Regulation 36420 to allow for businesses that are open to have to follow the advice, recommendations, or instructions from the Chief Medical Officer of Health, that's Dr. Kieran Moore, or local medical officer of health instructions after the local medical officer of health consults with the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Essentially, it changed the regulation to allow the Chief Medical Officer of Health or local medical officers of health to direct businesses that are open, which would essentially include employers, to adopt a vaccination policy. And it also, similar to Directive 6, it sets out what must be in that policy. On August 30th, the Chief Medical Officer of Health issued formal instructions to all post-secondary educational institutions that required those institutions to have a vaccination policy that applied to their employees, students, and basically anyone coming on campus. Those instructions had the force of law, and that's why you saw in the news many post-secondary education institutions just before the Labor Day weekend start coming online with vaccination policies. The instructions that were issued on August 30th to post-secondary educational institutions are essentially the same as Directive 6 in terms of its requirements, in terms of what a vaccination policy ought to contain. Proof of vaccination, or proof that an employee cannot be vaccinated due to medical reasons. And for those that can't provide proof of vaccination, regular antigen testing.
I think the one thing just to add in here, as we get into the local communications from our health units, there's specific information on the Windsor-Essex health unit site, and assume that many of you on the call are impacted by the instructions of the health unit. They specifically, for employers, do not necessarily say that there must be a vaccination policy or give strict directives like what Dave has mentioned. But what they do is they state that employers should actively promote vaccination to keep the workplace healthy, to reduce absences, to avoid outbreaks that can shut down workplaces and boost workplace morale. The medical evidence is that vaccination reduces the risk of a person getting the infection and transmitting it to others. So although not a directive, a strong recommendation and encouragement to employers to take the next step again, in the best interest of health and safety of persons and employees.
So as it stands right now, if you are an employer, if you don't fall under Directive Six, so you're not a hospital or a specified public health or healthcare employer, or if you're not a post-secondary education institution, the law in Ontario right now is vaccination policies are essentially optional. You're not required to have them today. Because Regulation 364-20 was changed to allow a local medical officer of health to provide instruction, recommendation, or advice to businesses that are open, that may change, and that may change on a local level. Right now, there are some health units that have, you may have seen in the news, Chatham-Kent Health Unit, Middlesex Health Unit have issued press releases strongly encouraging employers to have a vaccination policy. And they even provide like an online tool or guidelines for how to set up a policy. But right now, those are simply recommendations. They are not, they don't have the force of law as of yet pursuant to the regulation. Of course, that is subject to change and may in fact change. So in the absence of an applicable directive or binding recommendation, private sector employers or even public sector employers who don't fall under these two pieces of the regulations aren't required to have a vaccination policy today.
And there's many considerations as you contemplate what to do in determining whether a vaccination policy and or a testing policy should be implemented. Perhaps the greatest consideration is the type of workplace that you have. For example, are you operating a business serving the public who after September 22nd will only be accessible to fully vaccinated persons and therefore feel you should align and employ fully vaccinated employees? Or are you an employer who requires employees to do their work on site and to best protect their health and safety as well as reduce risk of an outbreak, which could negatively impact your business, believe that a vaccination and or a testing policy would be prudent? If you're an employer where most or all of your employees work remote and therefore may elect, you may elect not to implement a policy, but certainly advocate for employees to go and get vaccinated. So lots of considerations for you to make as employers around the type of workplace. The guidance, again, of the health professionals and the medical professionals is certainly to err on the side of advocating and or making requirements for vaccination, putting those in place. Another consideration is culture or impact to morale. Asking the question, will employees be grateful that a vaccination policy is committed to in order to put their health and safety first and to try and end the pandemic? If deciding to implement a vaccination policy, you need to consider if a testing policy will accompany, as has been talked about. And this may be the case if you're requesting employees to be vaccinated, but are not necessarily mandating fully vaccinated status in your vaccination policy. And we're going to talk more about medical and human rights exemptions and the specifics of those that may apply, and therefore may be reason to contemplate a testing policy. Privacy is another important consideration. This applies to how you gather and retain information on vaccination status. Typically, employers should consider collecting and retaining the minimum amount of personal information necessary. And for unionized employers, consideration obviously to the union as a stakeholder, as well as any existing collective agreement language would be a consideration. Many unions, including Unifor, who's the union that we partner with, have communicated their views related to vaccination and testing policies. So encourage employers, obviously, to have conversations with the unions that they're working with to see what their views are. And a related stakeholder group in unionized employers may include the Joint Health and Safety Committee, because of course the the overall importance of health and safety and the views and advocacy that are important from that group of employees.
Okay, so we just kind of gave you the state of the law in Ontario and some general considerations. We included a slide here that talks about the types of policies, and really this is, what we're seeing, at least in our office, and Julie's going to comment as well on their types of policies. But we have 4 basic bullet points here that describe the general types of vaccination policies that are emerging or being asked to comment on. The one is mandatory vaccination policy. This is the one that's getting all the news. This is our local hospitals have implemented a mandatory vaccination policy. They originally had a policy in place that was similar to Directive Six, essentially is aligned with Directive Six, and that was show proof of vaccination or proof that you can't get vaccinated for medical reasons or undergo regular antigen testing. The mandatory vaccination policy is different. It's a lot more stronger. It's you must be vaccinated, or basically, if you aren't going to be vaccinated and you don't have a human rights exception or a medical reason for not being vaccinated, you may be placed on unpaid leave, or you may be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. This truly is the front line of the law right now. Such a policy hasn't been legally tested. And frankly, such a policy may be viewed by a court of law or an arbitrator in a hospital context or frontline caregiving context with vulnerable people or patients as a reasonable policy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that would be viewed as a reasonable policy for a factory making widgets or a big box retail outlet. Context is critical when considering what is an appropriate policy for your organization, should you choose to have one, because right now you're not obliged to unless you fall under the 2 directives. The next type of policy that we're seeing is a vaccination or testing policy. This is, I'll colloquially call it the Directive Six policy. Provide us proof of vaccination. If you can't, then you're going to have to submit to regular antigen testing, not PCR testing, but antigen testing. Some policies have the cost of the antigen testing on employees. Some, the employers are just simply supplying the kits. A selective vaccination policy is a bit of a hybrid. And really it's a type of policy that is nuanced and informed based on a risk assessment of certain employee groups. For instance, you may have an organization that has a group of employees that are unable to social distance, that interact with the public, are kind of frontline, versus another group of employees that they can social distance. Maybe they're in a warehouse or something, there's no one else around. A selective vaccination policy is a type that essentially places perhaps more stringent requirements of vaccination on a higher risk group of employees and less stringent requirements on employees that are lower risk based on the nature of their job. The final type of policies we've seen, and these were a little more common about a month and a half ago, and I haven't seen as many nowadays, but they're essentially the soft policy. They're an employer statement on how they view vaccinations without any real teeth, meaning a policy that's adopted by an employer that encourages vaccination and encourages the voluntary disclosure of an employee's vaccination status without actually mandating that employees be vaccinated or mandating that the employees disclose their status, or a combination of these types of things. These policies are essentially a corporate statement or an employer statement on how they view vaccinations and how important they are, but really don't have any teeth to it in terms of compelling employees to do testing or to be vaccinated or otherwise. These policies generally also contain language that allows employees to access paid time off to get tested or to get vaccinated. They may include essentially a soft monetary incentive for employees to get vaccinated. But but those are rare. The policies that are getting all the news right now are the top two: the mandatory vaccination, be vaccinated or suffer possible detrimental employment consequences, or be vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you're going to be subject to regular antigen testing. I mentioned earlier, any policy that's adopted really needs to have the Human Rights Code and human rights considerations built into it. And really what we're talking about here is building in flexibility with a policy so that a protected ground under the Human Rights Code is accessible to employees who fall within that protected ground, meaning disability or medical reasons for not being vaccinated, or creed, and as most people are referred to as religion. The Human Rights Code actually doesn't use the term religion as a protected ground. It uses the term creed, which is actually broader than religion, because a creed could include an unrecognized religion. I'll get to what these terms mean. But basically, if you have a vaccination policy that requires employees to show proof of vaccination, you're going to need to build in a component that has exceptions based on bona fide human rights grounds. And those grounds relate to disability or medical reasons, or creed, which is close to religion or akin to religion. So what qualifies as a disability in this context? Health-related justification for being unable to take the vaccine. Requires medical evidence, it's a doctor's note or from under Directive 6, from a note from a nurse practitioner with an indication of a permanent or time-limited medical reason for why a person can't be vaccinated. And to date, government guidance suggests that only recognized permanent exception to be fully vaccinated is a severe allergic reaction to the first shot. If you go to the government of Ontario, the Ministry of Health, they have guidance on their Directive 6, and Directive 6 was the piece of law that required hospitals to have a vaccination policy and what should be in it. And they talk about what medical exemptions are possible. And frankly, they're almost non-existent. I believe they're non-existent for a first shot. They really only kick in on a second shot. I'm going to read what they say here. This is from the Ministry of Health. There are likely to be very few medical exemptions to COVID-19 vaccination. The largest group of individuals who receive a medical exemption will be those with severe allergic reactions or anaphylaxis to a previous dose of a COVID-19 vaccine or to any of its components, and who have been assessed by an allergist or immunologist to review methods for possible re-administration of a COVID-19 vaccine. So what, in the government's view, a medical exemption for being excused from having to be vaccinated really pertains to not doing your second shot, meaning you had a severe allergic reaction to the first shot. And I believe the other exemption deals with, in rare cases, the swelling of a heart in certain demographic. I believe it's males in their 20s. Those are essentially all that at least the provincial government considers as valid medical reasons for not receiving a second dose. I haven't seen a single thing published by the provincial government as to a valid medical reason for not receiving your first dose. And we're led to believe, frankly, there are none. So.
Yeah, I think this is an important clarification for all employers, because up to now, and I think there's still, some of this out there, is that there's a lot of, kind of inaccuracy around medical exemptions, and specifically feeling that there's going to be, way more instances of this showing up, and that's not going to be the case. I was sharing with David the other day that there was some, very recent public sharing of, doctors coming out. And one of the pieces of information that's interesting is that it was reported that the College of Physicians and Surgeons has now provided very clear guidance to doctors on when medical notes may be issued which are exempting a person from being vaccinated. And as Davis said, there's very, very few instances, and it would only be after the first dose has been administered.
So the other possible human rights consideration or exemption is creed. Again, the Human Rights Code actually doesn't provide a definition for creed. As I said earlier, creed would include religious beliefs or your religion, but it also could be broader. And so we get our guidance for defining the term creed from human rights decisions and also the Human Rights Commission. And of course, what they publish is not all beliefs qualify as a creed. The belief must be sincere, a deeply held belief, integrally linked to a person's identity, self-definition, and fulfillment that is part of a particular comprehensive system of belief. A belief that mandatory vaccinations or masks are politically or even morally wrong is not, at least in the Human Rights Commission's eyes, qualify as a creed. It has to be much larger. It has to be more expansive. On this front, I can tell you, myself and my colleagues here, we are starting to see some very interesting paperwork come forward from employees to employers seeking an exemption under creed. The common one I've seen is almost like a form letter. It's about 4 pages from a political action group called Action for Canada. And it cites numerous pieces of legislation, including the Nuremberg Code and the Charter of Rights and all manner of things. The long and the short of it is we're starting to see more of these types of requests that are going to be very difficult for employers to handle. It's hard to be the arbiter of a creed or one of an employee's creed. And frankly, if you receive these requests, I'm almost certain you're going to struggle with them. And you're probably going to need some legal advice on them, because not all creeds are going to constitute or trigger this exemption, or pardon me, not all beliefs are going to constitute a creed. But we live in a time where there's an internet, there's information readily available, social networking. And so we're seeing these types of requests. And I think they're largely from a bit of a political action group, but they are becoming more and more common. And they're difficult to, frankly, to adjudicate if you're an employer. So we want to talk a little bit about vaccine passports. And obviously, we're all aware that they're coming online on September 22nd. Of course, it's going to apply to non-essential businesses, things like indoor dining, gyms, movie theaters. And obviously, the government's also talking about a QR code app that will hopefully be rolled out by October 22nd that would essentially be able to show proof of vaccination status. Obviously, as employers, this affects you, may affect you directly, depending on your business. But more importantly, the vaccine passports, at least in my opinion, are probably going to serve to bring your overall vaccination rate within your own workplace up naturally. So most people are probably going to get a vaccine passport if they value indoor dining or going to movie theaters or gyms. They're likely to do that, which is naturally going to bring our vaccination rates a little bit higher in and of itself. This slide, proof of vaccination status. There's no formal requirement, so an employer can choose to accept the following. You actually get the actual vaccine receipt from your employee. Basically, make a copy or not make a copy, check a box, give the receipt back. There could be enhanced vaccine certificates. That's probably like the QR code. It's really what that's in reference to. You can have employees simply sign an attestation form saying they are vaccinated. without requiring them to provide proof of vaccination status. Essentially, would be an honor system. And you can also do through third-party collection and confirmation. Here at our firm, we have an application on our phones for daily screening. It was modified to essentially upload our vaccination status information. That was done once. And once it's done, our daily screening, you don't ask the same question, you just simply confirm that your vaccination status is the same as you previously uploaded. So there are ways to handle proof of vaccination status, anywhere from an app to the honor system to actually getting copies of the receipts. Privacy of employees must be respected. This gets a little complicated because you got to be careful who has access to an employee's vaccination status. Generally should really be limited to human resources, potentially the occupation, your joint health and safety committee. The point is, it's got to be identified and it ought to be strictly controlled. This is private medical information of an employee. It ought not to be shared with others. You're requesting because as an employer on the Occupational Health Safety Act, you're obligated to take all reasonable steps to ensure a safe workplace. This would be I'm sure would be considered a reasonable step in terms of determining vaccination status, but there are privacy considerations for your employees that you need to respect and consider.
I can comment with respect to our organization. We're currently using an attestation to confirm vaccination status for all applicable employees that are working in any of our offices. And to protect privacy, we are maintaining the information within human resources, as Dave has suggested. The other thing that's kind of been in the back of our mind, and we talked at the onset of this webinar around, how things are evolving and changing. And so we just decided, what, an attestation works for right now. And knowing the province is implementing a vaccine certificate system, we will then evaluate how we might leverage this longer term. So we will evolve the solutions as time goes on. And, using something that is more widely recommended or mandated by the government is not only advantageous from a privacy perspective, but reduces obviously the administration associated with requesting, collecting, and storing personal information.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Julie, this is you.
Yeah, that's okay. So a challenging aspect of any vaccination policy relates to what constitutes fully vaccinated status. And although not common, there may be circumstances that would impact the timing of employees getting a second dose. Because we know the definition of fully vaccinated today is 2 weeks after your last dose. And all of the approved vaccinations in Canada today are 2 dose, with the exception of the J&J, which is 1 dose. So individuals may need a little bit of additional time for various reasons before they get their second dose. So that should be something that's considered in vaccination policies, because we're going to talk about some of the elements of policies. And one recommendation is to put some timelines in place, but do give consideration that there might be unique instances specifically based on disability that would impact the timing of a person who has the intention to be fully vaccinated, but may not be at this time. The other thing that is a consideration is that there are new vaccines that are being approved all the time. In fact, there are some new vaccines expected to be approved and actually manufactured in Canada by the end of the year. So when putting your policy together or thinking of proof of vaccination, it's prudent to consider employees who have received vaccines not approved in Canada, but approved in other countries. And the last thing that is a consideration is testing policies and a vaccination policy. And when you think about the definition of fully vaccinated, how that's going to change over time, because one of the things that is being reported now is the waning efficacy of the vaccination over time. So it is absolutely forecasted that in the future, we will have requirements for a booster in order to maintain our fully vaccinated status. So these are just considerations when putting your policy together to think about as far as defining fully vaccinated, and then thinking about how you're going to monitor on an ongoing basis in the future the requirements.
Okay, so additional considerations. Your risk context. I alluded to this earlier. This really speaks to analyzing the nature of your workplace and the general risk of spreading COVID-19 and maintaining a safe workplace vis-a-vis current safety requirements and protocols such as social distancing, mask wearing, that sort of thing. Nature of the work, are employees working in close quarters with each other? Are they able to maintain social distancing or not? Do they interact with the public? Obviously, workplace that interact with the public increase the possibility of exposure to COVID-19. The physical environmental factors, are they working indoors? Are they working outdoors? Air circulation, ventilation, or do you have employees that are going to other workplaces or other entities that have their own vaccination policy that requires contractors or vendors or visitors to be vaccinated? Another consideration is, whether or not you are a unionized or non-unionized workplace. Obviously, if you are a unionized workplace, unionized employers will have to establish both a vaccine. If you choose to do a vaccination policy, you have to make sure it's not in contravention of your collective agreement obligations, in that it is, quote, reasonable in consideration of an old arbitration decision called the Kvp test. Anyone who does labor relations or labor arbitrations knows this case, as it's the most important case out there for it. Unilaterally implement employer policies, and whether or not determined to be reasonable or not by an arbitrator, and therefore any, adverse consequences for not following the policy, whether it'll be upheld or not. So you got to make sure that if you roll out a policy, that it's not inconsistent with your collective agreement provisions, and essentially that will pass the KVP reasonable test. If you're a non-union employer, you want to consider whether or not rolling out this policy is going to constitute or be alleged to constitute a fundamental breach of the employment contract, which could give rise to a claim of constructive dismissal. This really is going to depend on the extent of the policy, the type of policy. Obviously, a policy that simply says, as an employer, we encourage our employees to be vaccinated and to voluntarily disclose their status, there's almost no risk to that. But a policy that requires employees to be vaccinated or be placed on unpaid leave of absence or potential disciplinary action up to including termination, well, there's a much more serious risk to that, and whether or not that policy will be viewed as reasonable in front of a court. You may end up finding yourself under those circumstances seeing constructive dismissal allegations. One of the requests that Julie and I received was some general guidelines for policies. And so the slide talks about, so the Chief Medical Officer of Health and local health units are providing general guidelines for employers to follow when creating vaccination policies. There's a list of general considerations. I didn't make this list up. This is literally a cut and paste job from Chatham-Kent Health Unit's website. They have a 7 or 8 page guideline for things for employers to consider in terms of what should be in a policy. So identify the scope and purpose of the policy. That's pretty straightforward. List the action steps workers must take, meaning, do they need to show proof of vaccination? Do they need to be, if they can, do they need to be tested? Are they going on a leave? Are they going to be disciplined? These types of things need to be set out in the policy. Deadlines for when those employee actions must be taken by. List available supports for vaccination. That would essentially be maybe if your workplace has paid time off available or sick time, you might want to make that available for employees to use to go get vaccinated. The policy should have provisions in terms of what happens for those who are unvaccinated. Meaning, what if I fall within, or I feel I fall within a medical exemption or a creed-based exemption? Your policy ought to deal with that. It has to build in flexibility for the human rights code aspects. Your policy should talk about what happens if an employee doesn't comply. Are they going to be required to be tested? Are they going to be put on unpaid leave? Are they going to be disciplined? And I wish I could tell you right now how courts or arbitrators will view a policy that requires vaccination, or else they'll be on a leave or disciplinary action. There are no case law. There is no case law out there yet. It's the front line. And frankly, whether it's a reasonable policy or not is going to depend on the circumstances of your workplace in the job in question. The policy needs to talk about privacy considerations. Obviously, disclosure of the vaccination status is confidential employee medical information. So your policy needs to speak to who has access to it, how it's going to be treated, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be shared. There should be a contact person under the policy in terms of who they contact for disclosing vaccination status or the various steps that need to be taken under the policy. And the health units are requesting, or believe it's good guidance, that they're somewhere in your policy, it speaks to continued adherence to your current COVID-19 prevention measures, such as social distancing, wearing a face mask, hand washing, those types of measures. I mentioned at the beginning of this slide that this is literally a cut and paste job from the Chatham-Kent Health Unit. The Chamber does have links. We've provided the links to Middlesex Health Unit's website that has the guidelines for employers who are going to make or implement a vaccination policy, together with the Chatham-Kent one. I don't believe Windsor's Health Unit has a guideline yet, or has come out in to the extent like these other health units have highly recommending that employers adopt a vaccination policy yet. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if they do in the very short future, but the resources I'm referring to are coming out of Middlesex County and Chatham-Kent. This slide also, a further resource for you is the Chief Medical Officer of Health under Directive 6. So this is the directive that applies to hospitals, saying you have to have a vaccination policy. If you follow this link here, they actually have a sample vaccination policy for employers that would be, I guess, subject to Directive 6. Even if you're not subject to Directive 6, but you're considering implementing a vaccination policy, this is a good resource to look at. This is essentially what the provincial government views as what ought to be in a vaccination policy. Again, that type of policy is employees to provide proof of vaccination status, or proof that they can't be vaccinated due to medical reasons, or if they can't do that, then they undergo regular antigen testing. And I failed to mention earlier, but there's also an optional education component. Employees basically watch a video that speaks to the COVID-19 vaccinations, how they were developed, how they operate, etc. So, Julie.
The only other thing that's come up more recently with various discussions with employers across the province is when you're developing your policy is to consider the type of employees or other stakeholders where you may elect to outline requirements. For example, if you are an organization that has volunteers, or you have contractors, so more of a contingent workforce, what would the requirements be to be very explicit of those that are really any stakeholder that's regularly coming into your workplace. And some employers may also consider implementing vaccination policies that apply to customers or clients. The only other thing that I'll mention with respect to testing, David mentioned earlier that at most, what you want to have is something that's, sorry, at minimum, I should say, 7 days for a person to provide an antigen test. I'm not going to say it's a best practice, but it's certainly more common among those employers that are doing regular testing for those that are not vaccinated, is a minimum of 2 times per week. And that's showing up in a lot of policies from the information that's been circulating.
Okay, I'm mindful of our time, and it's exactly 12 o'clock, and appreciate we started a few minutes later. And I know there are some questions that were prepared prior to the seminar. Julie and I selected a few that we thought we could easily answer. As a lawyer, I'm always loath to answer essentially legal questions without one understanding the full circumstances of the inquiry in the workplace and what's happening. But here's a couple that we thought were fairly straightforward we could answer. So a question, can we ask an employee if they have been vaccinated? Yes. You could ask for vaccination status, or you could ask for them to voluntarily disclose what their vaccination status. I say you can do that simply because under the Occupational Health Safety Act, you have a positive obligation to take reasonable steps to ensure a safe work environment. Asking employees for their vaccination status, I believe, would fall within that mandate. Can an employer incentivize an employee to get vaccinated? Yes, not a problem. I mean, our county and city, you have a lottery going on right now. The incentivization could be very simple. It could be paid time off to get vaccinated, or access to other paid time off to be vaccinated, or if they have an adverse reaction to vaccination, to stay off work. I'm not hearing about other employers actually literally paying cash to employees to get vaccinated. The incentivization that I'm seeing is an easing of paid time off to be vaccinated, or paying people on work time to go get vaccinated. Can I require vaccination in a job posting? For new hires, yes. In fact, I've assisted clients with offer letters that indicate that the offer of employment is conditional on them providing proof that they're fully vaccinated. The only exception to that would be if they're unable to be vaccinated due to a legitimate human rights ground, creed, or medical reasons. So long as you have that flexibility built in, you can make a conditional job offer for new employment conditional on vaccination. Can vaccination status be disclosed to coworkers? No, not at all. Certainly not by the employer. In fact, you ought to treat an employee's vaccination status as confidential medical information. The question was, what is adequate proof of vaccination at large public events? To be honest with you, I started with this. I'm guessing you're probably going to have to wait for the provincial QR code application, which I would hope would be able to cover this, or at least have some level of functionality for a large public gathering event. How do you validate a creed-based exemption request? Great question. My first thing would be, you're probably going to need to get legal counsel on that. But generally speaking, you can ask the employee to sign an attestation that basically shows that this is a sincerely, deeply held belief that's connected to a larger system of beliefs that's integral to their belief structure. In some instances, you may ask the employee to provide a letter from the religious organization or a religious leader, if it's more in line with the tenets of a particular religion. The last question that we chose to try to address here: how do you regulate contractors coming into the workplace? Frankly, it's no different than what I think most people, places of business, have been doing for the last 18 months. You have a controlled entry, you have contractors complete a daily screening questionnaire, your regular COVID safety protocol matters. So our time is up. I guess in short, what I would summarize or conclude by saying is if you fall within Directive 6 or you fall within your post-secondary education institution employer, you've got to have a vaccination policy. The laws tells you what has to be in there. Those policies are provide proof of vaccination or proof of a medical exemption. Otherwise, you got to subject optional education and regular antigen testing. For all other employers right now, you're not legally obligated to have a vaccination policy, but many employers are implementing them, or at least contemplating implementing them. That landscape can change very quickly, given that Regulation 36420 was amended to give the Chief Medical Officer of Health or local medical officers of health, after consultation with the Chief Medical Officer of Health, the authority to essentially issue instructions to local employers or businesses that are open to have such policies. Right now, they haven't done that. Most health units are encouraging employers to do it, but they haven't gone so far as to make that with force of law. But the regulation has been amended to allow them to do that should they feel it necessary. And that's going to be dependent on how the pandemic continues to evolve. So you may, in a month's time, be required by your local medical officer of health to have a vaccination policy. So those are my comments. Julie, I don't know if you want to say a few concluding remarks.
Thanks. No, I think we've covered everything. I have been monitoring the questions. I think we've covered most of them. The only one that we might go back to when David talked about, can I require vaccination in a job posting? And he answered yes. I think the only additional point would be ensure that you've got a vaccination policy that's clearly outlined before you start to do that. Because there's got to be alignment between what you're stipulating in your policy and then making the requirements for any future employees. So that was, I think, the only one that perhaps we didn't cover. But anyway, yes, thank you, and it was great to be a part of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Julie and David. Really appreciate you making time for this. As we mentioned at the onset of the event, this is a complicated topic and it is evolving every day. So we do appreciate you sharing your insights. And as we monitor this and track this in the future, if things change massively, we'll be sure to get back to everyone with further updates on what's happening. And now I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Wendy, who's going to inform us and educate us more about the rapid tests.
Before everybody goes, I'd just like to give us a quick update on the We Stay Safe rapid test program. The Windsor-Essex Chamber of Commerce, Leamington Chamber, and Amherstburg Chamber of Commerce, along with their partners WeTech Alliance and FedDev, are facilitating the distribution of rapid test kits in Windsor-Essex County. The program is offered free of charge to all businesses with 150 or fewer employees. Businesses with over 150 employees can secure their kits with the Ministry of Health. The program will increase workers' access to COVID-19 rapid tests and help to detect COVID-19 quickly before more cases reach workplaces, keeping workers and their families safe and helping businesses to stay open. Rapid tests can be self-administered by the workers on site at your workplace. It takes 15 minutes for the results to appear, and the rapid testing program helps to provide peace of mind to you, your workers, and your customers. To date, the Windsor-Essex Chamber has distributed 42,675 rapid tests in Windsor-Essex County. If your business is already registered for the program, we thank you for participating. If you would like to register in the program, please go to westaysafe.ca and you can schedule an appointment to pick up your test kits. This concludes our webinar for today, and I just again would like to say thank you to David and Julie. That was a great presentation, and thank you for everybody that attended our webinar.